Welcome and thank you for joining us for this Supply Chain Security for Government Client Base webinar. My name is Marcus Claycomb and I'll be heading the show today discussing with Wes and Will some of the trials and tribulations with security and firmware integrity. As we have this webinar today, we have the comment section off, but we ask that you do Q&A in the question and answer section of the webinar. We will be answering those throughout the webinar. Anything that we do not get to, we will make sure to connect with you after the fact. Thank you for joining us today. Wes and Will, if you'd introduce yourselves.
Yeah, certainly. My name is Wes Dobry. I'm a global director at Eclipsium, and I focus on increasing security for all organizations around the world. Now, my background is ultimately, I've been a security practitioner, focusing on architecture, strategy, and emerging threat for the last 25 years. So that includes things like artificial intelligence, social engineering, as well as some of the most advanced threats of areas below the operating system.
Hey, I'm Will Coulter, the National Business Development Manager for Panasonic Federal Team. Prior to coming to Panasonic, I had a pretty extensive supply chain background. And then prior to that, I was a military officer for 8 years.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you both for being here today. We've had several discussions, Wes and I, about Eclipsium and the product that is called Smart Compliance. Most of the conversation that we've had so far has been through the mandates through the Department of Justice, the FBI, and CJIS for public safety access, specifically in law enforcement, and the most recent updates to those requirements being firmware integrity. So if we could kind of dive into why is that now being a focus and why is that important, generally speaking, and then we'll get into the supply chain aspects and the government at large issue of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about firmware integrity, or really device or platform integrity as a whole, this all goes into ultimately when we think about supply chain. When we think about how we acquire devices, how devices exist on our network, a big part of that is, are they what they say they are? Have they been tampered with? And is there anything that can bring the organization any form of risk? And that's really the area that Panasonic Smart Compliance, powered by Eclipsium, focuses on, is that arena below the OS, verifying that hardware hasn't been tampered with, firmware is exactly what's shipped from the manufacturer, and then most importantly, it doesn't harbor any threats or anything malicious within it in nature. Now, the US government, as well as worldwide governments, have started to emphasize the security of supply chain or reduction of supply chain risk management. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of some of those programs as we go through this, but ultimately it's all around verifying your suppliers, but also verifying the technology that's being delivered to your organization. And that's what we're here to talk through today.
And two of the things that really stand out are, one, most people have relied on the antivirus software, whatever flavor they use, right? And that they're assuming that the machine they get is safe when they receive it, and they are combating threats after the fact. So the two things that I want to focus on that we'll discuss today are, A, there's a lot of stuff happening under that, as you just said, and you can also now verify that when you get it from Acme Computer Company, it's exactly what they say it is, and it hasn't been tampered with, not just after the fact.
Which is, and if I can add to so Wes, alluded to supply chain, right? And as a former supply chain operations manager, technology expert in there, a lot of folks ask me, what does the supply chain mean? So supply chains are very complex, starting from the sourcing of those components. And so that's kind of what I think we're talking about on the supply chain to get that understanding of what is it. You get that computer from Acme, right? But the processor came from one country, or one supplier, and another component came from a different supplier. And so that's where I think Eclipsium and we're talking about supply chain, comes in and can help, right?
Well, I think supply chain is a buzzword that became very unpopular in the past several years. Post-COVID is really where most people probably heard about supply. If they weren't involved in that already, and that is from point A to point B being the client, and understanding that whole process.
And you don't necessarily see each part of that supply chain as an end user or an IT manager. You're just in some cases you're just trusting on that contractual obligation from different suppliers that you're not going to have any interaction with, right? So,
and that potential for that threat isn't necessarily acting as a bad company. It's a bad actor within that company for a variety of reasons.
And components move across the globe. You may not have a kind of quote chain of custody of one component that you're seeing there, that break in chain of custody. And that's where we need to bridge that gap, right?
And it's a trust but verify process, which we're all very used to. So let's talk about the specifics of that. When we talk about security under the operating system, what does that really mean?
Yeah. So, to Will's point, when we look at something as simple as a laptop, it touches 65 different countries, 200 different factories, 300 third and fourth parties that either bring in physical components into that device or software components. And a big part of that is the inspection of that specific firmware or hardware components for tampering. Now, when we think about the supply chain as a whole, there is the aggregation of those components to build the device, but then there's every hand that it also switches through on the way there. So that can be things like strategic integrators, value-added resellers, or even people that just receive it as part of the chain. So that's part of the inspection of it is, I always tell a little bit of a story where I think about, we are all guilty of this. We get that nice new shiny device at home. First thing we do is we take the plastic off of it, connect it to our wireless network. And I know I do that. I know I do that all the time. And, it's because I inherently think I should trust that device. What we look to do is to help organizations not only build their supply chain risk management and validate their suppliers, but then also validate that equipment before it ever touches anything with criticality. So you mentioned antivirus before. Antivirus, EDRs, XDRs, those types of solutions are controls that focus on what I'll say is securing the user and securing the device from the network and really making sure that nothing bad happens within the operating system. Nowadays, as devices become more complex, threat actors have moved down in the chain and started to go and do things like firmware-based implants. That's that area below the operating system, things like UEFI or CPU microcode, or even peripheral devices like network adapters and other. Now, these bad actors, when they move into that arena, they're able to do things that are at a higher level than even implanting into the operating system. So that can be things that give them higher levels of persistence. So even if you wipe and reload the device, they come back. Or doing things like data destruction, where they can destroy the data on that device, or even go so far as actually damaging the physical hardware so that device is out of service for a longer period of time.
So we've talked a lot about what the potential problems are and what the potential solutions are, but now let's talk about why Panasonic Connect and Eclipsium have partnered for this smart compliance option. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of funny. Before this, I was talking to Wes and looking on the NIST website, the National Institute for Security and Technology, right? And looking at firmware security, there was over 8,000 hits on that website. It is overwhelming, the amount of information, the standards, the executive orders, anything that's going to govern firmware security, right? So to answer, to go off your question, why this, why now, right? Eclipsium has done all the research for firmware security. They are the experts, right? We're kind of the best in class hardware. Pair that with best in class firmware security. And I think that's kind of like, for our customers, our end users, that's the why this, why now, right? I mean, you're seeing thousands upon thousands of attacks each day. And we need to combat that at a very serious level, right? So,
okay. So, to Will's point, when we think about even things like NIST 853, they've added controls over the last few years around system integrity. So not only do we have regulatory or compliance controls that we have to follow, we have, as an industry, been a little behind with trying to find the technology that can actually do this. And that's really where Eclipsium comes from, is that our background is in firmware research and firmware security as a whole. So we've worked towards building a technology that allows organizations to operationalize and validate this area below the OS at scale. Now, Part of that is taking the information out and looking at device firmware from the risk, compliance, and of course, vulnerability and threat side of things, but doing that at a scale that's never been done before. And that's our specialty, and that's what we try to help every organization to do. And we're already working with a lot of organizations and institutions around protecting their environment from monitoring for change, that threat, and any unknown vulnerabilities below the OS.
And the compliance aspect is driving it for the government base, the client base, the public safety base. There are definitely requirements in that. But as I said earlier, this really is an industry standard at this point. In the days of, I'm going to stick my head in the sand, it's not going to happen to me, it's going to happen to somebody, they're gone. And I mean, the other buzzword that most people are aware of, hopefully not from personal experience, is ransomware. And some of the other stuff that can be combated by this, so that you're not having controls inside when you get it, or we all know the weakest link is the employee, right? That you can put all the hardware and software solutions in place that you can to stop this from happening, but we still need to educate our employee base on our staffing, so there is still the possibility of these threats coming through after the fact. So you are able to validate you have the machine set up the way that you're supposed to, and that it was supposed to be delivered from the very beginning, and then you're creating a persistent set of security bays to ensure that is not hindered or attacked after the fact. So on that note, let me just ask you this. Maybe it would be easier. Can we take it for a test drive? Can you run us through a demo of what, it's easy to talk about it, but when we see it, that would be great if you could do that for us.
Of course. So
awesome.
Yeah, I've gone through and I have a demo right here where we can actually go through and show a little bit off of a couple different devices and give a little bit of an overview for what our solution actually does.
Excellent, thank you.
Panasonic Smart Compliance, powered by Eclipsium, gives organizations the capability to go and view below the operating system, inspecting for threats, vulnerabilities, out-of-date devices, as well as any changes that exist within an environment. So displayed here, you can see that we have our dashboard, which gives organizations information about what they have within their inventory of devices here in the middle. You'll also see down here at the bottom where we focus on risks in a couple different categories, things like threats, or threats being things where we find indicators of compromise within the firmware of devices themselves, or integrity failures being pieces of firmware that we have never seen before, don't know about, or contain behaviors that are suspicious in nature. Or you'll also see that we track things based upon vulnerabilities in systems. So this would be traditional, like to what we're used to dealing with vulnerabilities for, around things like applications and operating systems, except for our focus is the area below the OS. So this would be things like in the UEFI of the system, or the TPM or CPU microcode based vulnerabilities. And then around versions is identifying the firmware of devices that is either up to date or out of date on specific systems. This gives organizations the capability to track what their most critical threats are in a firmware perspective, as well as most vulnerable devices, most widespread vulnerabilities, and of course, the most critical vulnerabilities that exist inside their environment. Now, if we find anything that's of criticality that should be addressed immediately, you'll see it up here at the top around our detections, where if we find things like implants or bootkits or rootkits or backdoors, we'll actually display that so that your organization can get that. And of course, include that alert right to going sending out to your SIM and SOAR products so that you can go and use that as part of your standard response against these types of dangerous and nefarious behaviors. Now, if we take a look at this data here, we can then align this with things like compliance controls. That can be things like NIST 853 or CJIS for our criminal justice organizations. But if we look at NIST 853, for example, we take information within that control framework and map it to the information that we collect on specific devices or throughout the organization. So that can be things like flaw remediation or vulnerabilities. It can also be things around integrity of devices, where we can actually identify when we have things like integrity failures, or again, pieces of firmware where we can't ascertain it actually came from that manufacturer, or on the vulnerabilities or flaw side of things, mapping it to things that we detect so that it can be directly correlated with the controls that you're already assessing and investigating within your organization. Now, if we look at this and we take an example directly from a device, like in this case, I have a Panasonic FZ55, which I've scanned on, and we can see that this device is identified as trusted. We have known good firmware. We don't have indicators of compromise. We have a good analysis of the behavior of the firmware of the device. Now, we do see that this device is a little bit outdated from a firmware perspective, but ultimately, this device has no vulnerabilities and only one misconfiguration found, which is, of course, in this case, a minor misconfiguration around things like BitLocker not being enabled in a standpoint that's secure. But when we look at the components, this is where things get into the specific areas that we focus on with Panasonic Smart Compliance powered by Eclipsium. That's the area below the OS where we're investigating things like the UEFI and the CPU microcode and the TPM configuration settings, as well as other areas like Intel ME's component or management engine, where we go and extract the firmware from the device and verify if it's trusted, if it came from the manufacturer, if it has behaviors which can be trusted in that specific system. We also go and look to see if there's any vulnerabilities within that device itself or that piece of firmware to understand if there's any risk brought to your organization from that piece of hardware. Now, on this case, this is a device that's relatively current, and of course, that it has no vulnerabilities, and it's a good standpoint. If we take a look at a device, and my demo device that's sitting on my coffee table, which I've gone and done malicious things to, we can see that again, it has known good firmware that came from the manufacturer, but we can see that there's indicators of compromise that exist on it or known malicious things, and we've also identified malicious behaviors within the firmware on this device. You can see right here at the top that we have a threat that's been detected on it, a boot kit with secure boot bypass. You can also see that I've done an implant on this specific system itself. Now, in this case, this device has 82 vulnerabilities. That's up 17 vulnerabilities from the last time that it's scanned. And ultimately, as we take a look at this, this system has a ton of vulnerabilities because it hasn't been updated in a while. And ultimately, it's a system that, isn't done in a fashion where, it's ultimately a risk to an organization. So in this system, I've gone ahead and installed a bootkit on it so that you'll see down here at the bottom that we say, hey, this device, as part of its bootloader, is actually compromised. Now, all of this comes together to give you this level of visibility for the area below the OS, diving into the specific details of a system. So when we take a look at this device here, you can see all the vulnerabilities contained within this specific piece of firmware. You can see that I haven't updated the firmware on this device since 2016. And in this case, we've actually extracted 520 different bits of firmware off of this device, or UEFI binaries. And ultimately, all of those match with what we actually expected from the manufacturer. We also take those same binaries and analyze them against behaviors, risks, known indicators of compromise, and look for anything that may bring risk to your organization. Now, all of this is also tracked to identify any changes against that specific device from a hardware or firmware perspective. Ultimately, this is all about implementing controls to identify, has the device changed? Is it something that can bring risk to your organization? Are there vulnerabilities in it? And ultimately bringing it back to the main dashboard here of, does this device bring any risks or anything that you may be concerned about from a hardware or firmware perspective?
Welcome back. Thank you very much for that incredible demo. I think that resonates with people a lot more to be able to see it, feel it, and understand it, especially those that aren't tech savvy. So we talked about supply chain, we talked about government at large, but my background coming from law enforcement and public safety, I think there's some direct translation to the CJIS security protocols and those on the federal side that you will name for me later. But those the mandates that require these security levels to be in place. So can we talk about the MP and security forces parallel, but then the government and federal team at large when it comes to the military and those mandates? Again, I say this is industry standard. We should be putting this place anyway. But in those places where it's mandatory to be put in place, can we kind of talk about that and why that's important for the military and the security forces?
Yeah, and I think the acronym CJIS most of the defense is probably not going to understand that acronym, right? Because it's probably like this much of a greater level of governance policy, right? So when we say CJIS, it obviously is going to apply to federal law enforcement, MP, security forces, naval, marine, police. But Wes is, I think it'd be better if you probably explain the other part of that.
At least some examples of those.
Yeah.
So when we even look at CJIS and the Criminal Justice Information System Security Policy, specifically SI7 around system and firmware and information integrity, that actually came from NIST 853. I think it was Rev 3 it was added in. Now, NIST 853 is kind of the foundational framework that most compliance frameworks pull controls from. So we're seeing this in other areas, of course, like CMMC, in the DoD and impact levels 3 and 5, where we're seeing these controls start to flow into other frameworks. We see it in things like the critical infrastructure with NERC, SIP, and FERC, where we're starting to see maybe not the exact same language, but the core of it around we need to secure our supply chains, we need to secure our devices. That is ultimately what we're starting to see. And if it's not in the framework that your organization is using today, if it's not in there soon, it likely will be. We're even seeing this flow into things like NIST CSF, or the Common Security Framework, where ultimately we're going to see it flow into commercial entities as well. And this is ultimately foundational challenges that as a whole we need to actually solve. Recently, the administration actually did some executive orders and memos around we need to secure things like understanding where code comes from, understanding what the provenance and country of origin of code is, as well as things like we need to get better about UEFI security. And those memos are guiding things like these control frameworks to build the controls in, which ultimately that's where we come in, is we're the technical control and technical enforcement on these things.
Right, and you mentioned something else there. So we've talked about criminal justice system, defense, but other verticals or other industries like healthcare, you guys, Eclipsium has that capability to protect those infrastructure as well, right?
Yeah, even scenarios like where HIPAA applies, while it's not stated in HIPAA, if you read between the lines, the idea is that they want to ensure that patient data, or critical data for that matter, is protected. And now typically we've always looked at that as, let me put in controls that protect the network, protect the user, protect the applications. That whole area of hardware and firmware has largely been ignored. And what we're finding is that, again, the threat actors, to Marcus's points earlier, have started to move down in the stack a little bit. We're hearing about things like Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon that are impacting things like infrastructure and telecom organizations. But we also hear about things like Black Tech and Black Lotus. Black Tech being an APT that attacks Cisco branch routers to get back to central locations. And there was some great documentation from the NSA on that. Black Lotus was actually the first UEFI bootkit that was released in the wild. And it was released on the dark web, I think it was October of 2023, and it was released for about $5,000. And so that lowered the barrier of entry for effectively these bad actor groups to get a very persistent and capable technology that allowed them to do very nefarious things that EDRs just simply couldn't see.
Yeah, that's great, because if you're looking at a military installation and your utility component, your healthcare component, it's like many cities, right? Self-sustaining mini cities. So it's not maybe just deployed units. It's going to hit your police, fire, your healthcare, your commissaries, all that critical infrastructure, right? So.
Yep. Yeah, and part of the challenge is it may not even be your infrastructure that gets hit. It could be a third or fourth party's infrastructure that gets hit. And then that whole, again, going back to supply chain challenges, if we have a scenario where a third party that you're relying on is down, now suddenly that's impacting your ability to deliver services or be successful on your mission. And those are things that we now have to worry about too.
It's the protected data, the HIPAA, PPI, all that important information, but it's also the operations, right? I mean, the point that you make is it's one thing to protect the data and that not being taken and used for nefarious reasons. It's another thing not to be able to do your job right now, real time. So both of those things obviously apply. So, Will, I want to touch on something that you had talked about earlier, and you had talked about the best-in-class marrying of two best-in-class solutions, hardware and software solutions. Panasonic has been a leader in the marketplace for Toughbooks and rugged solutions hardware for going on 30 years, and clearly tip of the spear, and they've been leading the charge on that. Eclipsium's been around for a very long time doing the same thing and as individuals, but now Panasonic is clearly realizing that they are providing the leader in hardware, but it would be beneficial and add value to customers to marry solutions that make sense, that add value, and it's another tool in the toolbox. And in this case, it allows the Toughbook to be tough inside and out, right? We create the hardened solution, and then you create the hardened solution for the inside for the software coverage. Can you talk about that a little bit more and why?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess looking back since the mid or early 1990s when Toughbook was introduced into the market, right? Our devices are going into some of the most critical missions, between police, fire, frontline, warfighter, et cetera, right? When one of our customers opens that laptop or device, turns it on, they expect it to work. They expect it to be like a no-fail, like they're trusting that device to operate, right, to perform. And I think, if there is a vulnerability, let's say the firmware or cybersecurity, that's going to tamper with that critical mission, it's a failure on a critical failure, right? So why not have the best-in-class firmware that's going to protect it from the lowest level, below the operating system on up, right? So from BIOS level up, where we're not. It's not even a factor, right? We're not even thinking about it failing, right? So Toughbook is in the name, right? So
you're ensuring the mission critical device. So it's a benefit for Panasonic to ensure that delivery, but it's also a benefit for the client base to ensure it's going to work when they need it to.
Right. I mean, like, for instance, I was in Afghanistan. I carried a Toughbook with me for 15 months, right? One point was, one day I opened my Toughbook and there was a blue screen. Something had infiltrated from a bad actor throughout the entire Bagram security zone that a majority of the devices had to go back in, get wiped, and re-imaged. And that was a major disruption to our operation, right? I mean, that's just like one personal example I can give that we need, we saw that we identified this need for a Toughbook. And for our customers, it's going to actually probably go farther than just the Toughbook. We can help offer it to other devices within our customers' network.
Absolutely. So one thing is the example that you gave. It's not the hardware. The hardware is not the issue. We need to make sure that there's security 360 degrees around that, so that the bad actors can't get in to find those weak points in the software or the BIOS.
Right.
And yes, to that point, this solution does cross on any machine.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be a Panasonic machine. We want to make sure that you're protected. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. So we're a vendor agnostic solution. So while we work very closely with Panasonic, we support any makes and models of almost any device out there. This even goes into some what I'll call specialized devices, things like cross-domain solution or CDS devices, where we're helping organizations to validate the integrity of it before, during, and after mission. That way, whatever that device is doing, we can ensure that the data collected on it is as it should be, hasn't been tampered with, and can be trusted. And we are even working on some other fun, different projects, and ultimately, it's scenarios around the most critical infrastructure that this world sees. We want to help protect it, and that's why we're trying to go and get help with things like Panasonic to talk to organizations and understand exactly how we can benefit them and what our technology can bring to their organization.
I think that's one underlying factor. One of the common denominators is both companies care. And they care about the client, they care about the security and the ability to operate in those high profile situations, but really anybody. And it's marrying two great solutions together to ensure that the client gets what they need and what they want anytime they need it.
Absolutely.
So we talked about the hardware that it works on. We know clearly it works on Toughbooks. Let's talk about operating systems. Where does this smart compliance solution work?
Yeah, so smart compliance works on pretty much any device, Windows, Linux, as well as Mac devices. And we also can remotely inspect other pieces of equipment, so things like switches, routers, firewalls as well.
Fantastic.
Interesting you mentioned Linux. We just announced 2 weeks ago that we entered a partnership with Red Hat to be the only rugged device manufacturer to be partnered, to be certified on Red Hat. So that
was a big announcement recently.
Yeah.
So that covers all of the operating systems and the hardwares, and you can remote in, which is especially important in those secure locations like the federal government, like CJIS, DOJ, FBI, that kind of stuff too. That's awesome. So we have a multitude of options in locations and ways to.
And through this partnership with Red Hat, we've discovered even more critical components that are operated off of Linux, like aircraft, ground vehicles that are, critical. Aside from critical infrastructure, critical components to the battlefield, right?
Thank you, Will. We've covered a lot of information here today. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you think you'd want to add before we wrap?
The only thing I wanted to say was just really around supply chain security is the paramount number one thing that we see as an emerging threat vector. We're in scenarios where we have to worry about nation states implanting into these supply chains and doing malicious things. We have scenarios where we have to worry about third parties being impacted, and that can be third parties that are software vendors, where we saw with things like the XZ software package, where it was implanted in there and could have affected, almost every device on the planet. And ultimately, that's just simply where I want to help organizations protect themselves, and I'm always happy to have additional conversations.
It was a very recent example of hardware being manipulated before it got to the end user that was fairly catastrophic.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Anything from you, Will?
No, I would say maybe aside from just operational disruptions, the financial implications of cybersecurity attacks. Coming into this webinar, we were just one of our, without naming names, one of our manufacturing suppliers was recently hit with a cybersecurity attack, and they had an insurance policy, but on top of that insurance policy, it cost them, I think, another $500,000 to remediate that cybersecurity attack. So, the financial disruption to the organization and the operational disruption to the operation too is important. So,
I go back to the head in the sand is no longer the security solution for for protected information
Absolutely.
at large. All right, awesome. Thank you both very much for being here today. I appreciate you, Wes and Will, the subject matter experts, and joining us today to share the information that you did. I thank you for joining us today. If we did not get to your question, we're going to continue to answer it. If you think of anything after the fact, please get a hold of us. Information on the screen today is for Will and Panasonic Connect at large. Please reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or if you'd like a demo or you'd like to inquire about any of the other hardware and software solutions that we provide. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you on the next one.